Okay, now I'd like to introduce Linda Lowther, who's kicking off the afternoon for us. So, Linda's background is in modern languages and education. She's worked in education all her life, most recently as the Senior Director of Public Education and the Assistant Deputy Minister from PEI, who brought in full-day early learning into PEI, and she's going to tell us about that and the challenges of that. And yesterday I had the privilege of hearing Linda describe their journey of implementation. And she led this with a mixture of knowledge of what children needed in their lives to prosper, knowledge of the very complicated systems that crisscross in the kindergarten world, and absolute determination. And I hope that you'll hear all of these now. She'd been set a task and she was going to make it happen, and it has happened. So.
Okay, so I have 30 minutes to tell you what we did in about 9 months. Thank you very much for those kind words. The first thing I do want to tell you, and as she told you, my background's in modern languages. I was a French immersion teacher, so what do I know about early childhood development? So I'm very humbled to be among all of you who know way more about early childhood development than I do. However, very few people beat me at being very passionate and determined. I'm a Taurus, I'm bullheaded, and when I want something, I get it. So thank you for inviting me to talk to you about this today. Bonjour, je suis prête à prendre des questions en français à la fin aussi, si quelqu'un veut parler en français. The first point I want to talk about before I get into the slides, I've heard a lot about, well, PEI was able to do this because they're small, and I just want you to know that being small also presents its own challenges. We had challenges, for example, where every child care center owner knows the premier personally. And can pick up the phone and say, you know, I don't like this part or I like that part. You pick up the phone and you get in, you know, you get to talk to the minister and you get to talk to the premier very easily. So that's one of our challenges. The other challenge, and I'll talk about that later in the lessons learned, is we have quite often one person doing something rather than a team of people. And if you lose that person, you lose capacity and there's a burnout factor. So what I want you to imagine is, rather than PEI, this initiative being a provincial initiative, imagine us as just a large school board or a medium school board. And things will be more in context for you when you think of it that way. And I just wanted to tell you that even one challenge was trying to find a name for this initiative, and somebody came up with Preschool Excellence Initiative, and if you look at the initials, that spells PEI. so most people don't realize that till you get into it. And then, of course, we had to do it in French, right? So then you have to do IPE, so we had fun with that. So I want to give you a little bit of the history or the catalyst for the initiative. In our province, we were the last jurisdiction in North America to not have kindergarten in our school system. Kindergartens were in community-based early learning centers. So they could be in a church, they could be in a community hall, they could be in someone's business, and some of them were in schools. We had about I'm thinking close to a dozen in schools across the province. And this government decided that kindergartens would be part of the public school system. And although our kindergartens were community-based, they were funded, the programming was funded by the province. They just weren't located in schools. So when government decided to move kindergarten into the public school system, that was going to have an impact on all of the early child care centers, because you were moving the kindergartens out and taking the funding out and taking very highly qualified early childhood educators out of those centers. So I've been asked today to talk about the consequences of that, which is the PEI initiative. So what happened to those early learning centers after kindergarten came out? However, during the questions later on, if you want to know more about how we implemented kindergarten in the school system, I can talk to you about that, whether it's labor issues, PD, what we did for unions, how we moved the buildings. And we did both initiatives at the same time, and which was a huge piece of work. So because kindergarten was going to have by removing kindergarten out of the early years centers, it was going to have a huge impact on those centers, we had to do something very quickly to make sure that our families and our children still had childcare and learning opportunities, and that was being severely jeopardized. So one of the things that our province did was to hire Kathleen Flanagan, and I want to recognize her because she's our resident expert. Yes. Kathleen wrote the Early Years Report, which is on the website of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development on PEI, and you can refer to that if you wish. And the PEI initiative, or the Preschool Excellence Initiative, was government's first reaction to her report. All the recommendations in that report have yet to be implemented. They're not all implemented, but it was the first part of those recommendations. And I think government is committed to going to full implementation of the report. We're going to have an election in October. They're now developing their platform, and I know from very good source that the first parts of the platform in learning that they're working on is on the early childhood side. So what I'm going to present is government's first reaction to that report and its first reaction to the fact that our centers were in jeopardy. So what I'm going to do here is give you a little bit of a context for what our centers were looking like and in the context of the province. So we have about 2,000 children, and those enrollments have gone up a little bit in regulated programs. About 10% in infant programs or in the infant age group. And so it looks like about a third of our children were in regulated programs in the province. We also, in our province, have the highest number of spaces, regulated spaces per capita in Canada, and the highest number of working moms with young children in the province. And that was one of the reasons I think that government really wanted to try to clean this up, because we had a lot of moms who needed some help. And PEI is no different, although it's more of a rural community. It's no different than any province or many jurisdictions. People from the country are moving to the city, so grandma's not there anymore to take care of the child, so we're looking for spaces all the time. We also had the highest fees for parents in Atlantic Canada and the lowest wages for our early childhood educators in the country. And we had overcapacity in some areas of the province, and we had undercapacity in some areas of the province. And we didn't really have good comparable data on how what the cost was per enrolled child in the regulated sector. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to figure out, if we take kindergarten out of the early learning centers, what is going to be the impact on those centers? And we had 95 centers total, 51 of which were viable, and the rest of them are severely at risk of closing. And the way we found this out is every single center submitted their financial statements to us. So we were able to see exactly how centers were functioning. And let me tell you, I'm sure it's no different in any other jurisdiction. A lot of these people are working for nothing. There's many of these centers which were operated as businesses, and I have a business on the side, and these people at the end of the year might have had $5 in their pocket. They really were not making any money, so it was not a good situation. So we knew that we were going to lose a lot of centers, but some of them we wanted to lose because they weren't all great, so we had to kind of come up with a plan of how this was going to work. Also, the parent fees had quite a range in the province, and you can see them there. What government decided to do, and I'll talk more about the exact policy at the end, is to pick the median, not the average, but the median. So half of the parents were paying less and half the parents were paying more. So on the right-hand side, the median for a full-day service is $32.25 and 20, and actually that's wrong. It should be 26 and 25. I should have fixed that slide. So immediate solutions that government decided to do was to convert from a childcare sector to an early learning system. And let me tell you, the stars really aligned for Prince Edward Island. We had a minister who was extremely well-versed in the importance of early childhood development. He was a principal in a school. He was, previously to that, he had been a special education teacher, so he was very supportive. The provincial minister of finance or provincial treasurer, depending on the province you're from, have different names. His wife and daughter both worked in the sector. We had a premier who was very committed. What we had the biggest challenge with were some of the senior policy analysts that worked out of the premier's office who just didn't get this. And if you're working in the policy area, and I know some of you are, one of the things that we have to do to get a policy through is make a presentation to a cabinet committee called the policy committee, and then a presentation to cabinet. And if you get in once for 20 minutes to try to explain something this complex, you're lucky. We got in 11 times, 2 hours minimum each time. That's how complex this is, and we wouldn't give up. We just kept going back and back and back. So finally, government did decide that it wanted to refocus its whole system, the whole system, and encourage collaboration between all of the partners, while at the same time respecting existing centres. So although in Ontario, I know the idea is to have school boards try to manage a lot of the centres in our province, because the problem was immediate, they decided to respect the existing centres as is, so that they would still remain independent from school boards. However, encouraging them to move into schools. And we do have, like I said, about a dozen centres that are located in schools, but they're not operated by the school boards. They're operated independently. We also wanted to create infant homes, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And we wanted to rationalize the sector, and that was to try to cut back on the spaces where there were too many spaces and to add spaces where there weren't enough. So the first part of the plan was to create early years centres. And because the language differs from province to province, I'm going to explain what our new world looks like. We call centres private centres if they didn't become an early years centre. The early years centre is the new model that is very highly funded and controlled and regulated and managed by, not managed, they're managed independently, but really highly controlled by government. We have an operational criteria that I will get into a little bit more later on, but here are some of the things right now that we expect early years centres to do. We wanted to develop a curriculum framework, and that's from birth to age 4. And Kathleen's been working on that. We wanted them to be open year-round. So if they're in a school, they still have to be open year-round. We want all our staff to have at least some level of certification with PD and coordinated in-service. We wanted good geographic distribution. So in other words, if you were in the East End or the West End of the province where the number of children was small and it was very difficult to keep a centre open, we were still wanting to support that community in keeping its centre open. We required all of the early years centres to have a parent advisory committee. And let me tell you, to have somebody who has had a private business for a long time without a parent advisory committee tell you, I don't need them. I've run my business for 15 years without advice from parents. This was something new for a lot of people. We wanted the centres to try as much as possible to have a 40 to 50, at least 40 to 50 children. And that's for economies of scale. Because you can, and plus for programming and all kinds of reasons. Kathleen's early years report said we could even go up to 80. We do have some centres who have over 80 children, but what happens is they have 2 different licenses. So they have 50 over here and 50 over there, but they still have 100 kids in the centre. We wanted an integrated model where centres would accept special needs children and infants. And what was happening when they were private businesses, there's not a whole lot of money to be made to take infants. As most of you know, that's an expensive clientele. Or it's a lot of work to take special needs children. So we had centers in the province before this model who would not take infants and who would not take special needs children. So if you wanted to become an early years center, you had to take at least a minimum of 3 infants. And some of them did already. Some of them had 9 or 12 or whatever. But now you had to take infants and you had to accept special needs children. And the new funding model was also going to set a fee for parents, a wage grid for early childhood educators, and set a margin for an operating margin for operators, and government paid the difference. So if I summarize the funding model in the easiest possible terms, it's a little more complicated than this, but basically we have a new wage grid for educators, so we take their salary plus their benefits, we add 22% on for operating. We subtract the parent fees, and government pays the difference. That's the easiest way I can explain it. So that some centers get more money than others because they may have fewer kids or whatever. But the rest of the criteria is basically the same for everybody. So this is the set fees that we did set, and the wage grid for early childhood educators. I have the grid that I'll show you in a minute, but we decided we would have 4 certification levels. So people who were working in the sector before were paid all kinds of wages, but generally the lowest possible wages. And we decided that we wanted our educators to be paid more. Now, when I show you the wages, by Ontario standards, they're still low, but by PEI standards, they're pretty average. They're much better than what they were getting before. 40 to 50% increase, actually, in wages. And because all of the early childhood educators, many of them, 115 of them, left the sector to go to teach kindergarten, we had a whole lot of needs for staffing in the early years centers where people would have the minimum number of required staff that might be certified, and then they'd hire whoever they could find that could breathe and put them in a center so they could be there to babysit the kids. You know, fresh out of high school, we'll pay you $9 an hour and come and work for me. And we wanted to eliminate that. We wanted everybody to at least have some minimum training. And nobody was registering at the college for the program because, and somebody talked about that this morning, because nobody saw a future in it at $9 an hour. So we wanted to change that. So the first thing we did is, because people needed to hire people fresh off the street, we required them to have a minimum 90 hours of training. And that's our first level, our lowest level, this 90 hours of training. Well, nobody offered 90 hours of training. So we had to work with the college and the Collège Acadie to offer a program for this 90 hours. And I'm going to talk about that later on. But the grid has 4 certification levels, which is 90 hours, 1 year, 2-year diploma, and post-diploma for mostly supervisors or directors. And the 13% that you see there has actually been changed. I think it's up to 15 now because we're playing with numbers. We didn't know how this was going to work, you know. Oh, and I must tell you this, when not knowing how this was going to work, you can go on Google. I'm sure that the YouTube video is there. We were building this plane as we were flying it. It was quite the exercise. We set the operating margin for operators at 22%. And we said if you have a 90% occupancy, you should be able to even make money at this. And government pays the difference, and we were hoping that this would be sustainable for centers as well as government. We also wanted to create infant homes because not everybody wants their infant in an early years center. Some people want a home atmosphere. I will tell you, not that we failed miserably on this, we just haven't had time to work on this piece yet. This is our next step, and I'm saying ours, even though I've retired from the department, I still feel like I'm part of the team. So what we're trying to do is find, one of the parts of the plan is to find the unregulated home centers and ask them to become regulated infant homes, and we will support them. And we'll link them to early years centers and family resource centers for PD and for materials and that kind of stuff. And you see here that we would give them a startup grant so they can go buy the cribs and do whatever they need. So this hasn't moved along yet. And this is my youngest grandson, by the way. So this is, again, some of the workplace training that we did. The 90-hour entry level I've talked about, and it's during while people are working. They don't have to lose salary while they're doing this. We've asked them to now develop a 90-hour infant care model so that when we have infant homes, those people can take some training, a before and after school program for 90 hours, and also a post-diploma program for directors. And this is new training. So it all has to be developed, well, although some of it does exist in other jurisdictions and so on. What we do have is a 2-year diploma at Holland College and College Kedzie right now. This is the wage grid. Our staff level our directors were on average being paid $15 an hour. If you were a new director, you are now getting $21, and we have a 5-year grid. So if you're on year 5, you actually make $23.64. And some of you who maybe are in the labor field, most of our early years centers are not unionized. We have 5 that are unionized, and these wages, for the most part, not in all cases, are higher than what the union had negotiated. And we met with the union, and I think they're going to leave us alone. So I think that's what's going to happen anyways. So now you see where certified educators were getting about $12. Now most of them are getting in the 16-something range, and so on and so on. We don't want that bottom line, that uncertified, we don't want any more of those. People have till January 2012 to finish implementing every part of the operating criteria that we're insisting upon, because we couldn't say you can't have uncertified staff when there was nobody available. So they have to take their 90 hours or their one-year program before January 2012. Transition support is another support structure that we put in for centers. So infrastructure support, we had 2 kinds, one for those who were in schools and one who were in private centers. We weren't in the business of building private centers. So what we did is for schools, if a school had to be renovated because the center in the school never took infants, for example, we had a budget to allow the school to do that. It wasn't huge, but we've managed to renovate about a dozen schools in 2 years to accommodate that, like if I count last year's fiscal and this fiscal now. The infrastructure support for centers that existed was for things like buying cribs, buying new toys, because maybe they only took 3- and 4-year-olds before, and now they have to take all ages. Maybe renovating because they had a special needs child coming in and they never had special needs children before. That budget was about $900,000 a year. The applications that came in were about double that, so we're working slowly at picking away at that. The parent fee assistance, as I told you, the fee that was selected, half the parents actually were paying less before this was implemented, and we didn't want families to suffer because of this. So what government decided is that no one should pay more than $1 more per day. So if I was paying $20 per day, and now my new fee is $25, parents are only paying $21, and government is paying the difference because they didn't want to penalize families for that decision. Licensed retirement fund. So remember earlier I told you there was 95 centers and 50 of them were viable. And in Charlottetown, Summerside, and Montague, which are the 3 larger centers, we had too many spaces. So we were hoping that some people said, okay, I've had enough of this, I want to retire. And exactly the number we were hoping would retire did. The one advantage of being small is you know who they are, and you can say, I know that person's going to go, and that's a good thing. So we had a little bit of a fund to get them out of the business. And it also, just get them out of there. We weren't helping anybody. And we also had a bridging fund so that if people had some expenses that were over and above what we felt was in that 22% operating, we would bridge them. So for example, we have one center where they had just moved in not too long ago into a new building. They had a lease with the owner of the building that couldn't be broken, and it was a beautiful center. They built it just for what they needed, and they couldn't get out of their lease, and the operating fund didn't cover the difference, so we covered the difference for them until their lease comes up, and we'll probably always have to cover the difference because their rent's not going to go down. We also provided legal and financial advice. The Early Childhood Development Association, which is a professional organization of the early childhood educators in Prince Edward Island, it's not a union, it's really a professional organization, took the lead on a lot of this stuff for us. we gave them funding so that they could hire accountants and lawyers to give advice to people. And a lot of the centers really needed accounting advice because, as I said, it was shoebox accounting in many cases. And the accountants met with centers and explained the formula and what it meant for them and looked at their enrollments for the last couple of years and showed them how this was going to work. So there was a lot of cooperation and collaboration, and we had to give the ECDA some core funding so that they could provide this service. I'm really flying through this. Just to show you how government's commitment, somebody mentioned this morning about, I think it was Steve and Alan, about getting a little bit of money to do stuff. Rarely do you see a government doubling a budget. This is practically a doubling of our budget in early childhood. It went from 5.3 million to 9.9 million. So it was an amazing, amazing task for government to even do that. So I'm going to go through the process that we actually put these poor people through. Government made, well, first of all, before making any announcement, and this is very important in the lessons learned, the minister, the deputy minister, and our team, and when I talk about our team, I'm talking about me, Carolyn Simpson, and Donald Darash, the three of us. That's not a huge team. We had regional meetings across the province, and we met every educator and director so that the educators knew that the politicians and the bureaucrats were trustworthy, were on the same wavelength, wanted to know what they felt, and listened. And so we did a lot of meetings. Then the initiative was announced in late May. We met with all the educators to explain that funding formula, to explain what we wanted, what the operation criteria would be, and we said, we want you to decide if you want to be on board and be an early years center or remain private or retire your license, and you've got 30 days to make up your mind. So some people said, that's not very much time. Other people said, we've been waiting for 40 years for this. I know exactly what I want to do. And those are the people that came on board very quickly. Then, when they had made up their mind, we met with them again. Because then they said, okay, I want to be an early years center, so what do I have to do? And Donald Roche and myself met with, there were 50 that applied, which was perfect. We met with the 50 of them. We went through the criteria and we said, oh, by the way, you're in a basement. You don't have enough light. Move. You know, and we were very, very tough with people. But really, it was pretty smooth because people knew we were serious about funding them. It could have been as simple as making sure that all their staff are certified. But in some cases, we actually asked people to move. So this is basically just the timetable, and I just went over that basically where by July, those who were accepted to be early years centers were told so, and that's when we asked them to tell us how much money they needed to survive the changeover. And then we thought we'd have a lot of applicants, but we thought only about 20 of them would be ready for September gone by. There were 40 that worked all summer to renovate their centers or do what they had to do to be ready. So this timeline is what we had proposed, but it's not what happened. We had 40 centers by January, and if you look at this, it says in January we would implement the second round, like the next 20, but they were all there, they were all ready. Part of this as well is to do some evaluation and research, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next few minutes. Just want to go back to the operating criteria. And I don't have a paper list to pass out today, but it covered everything from the physical space inside and outside, what we expected, the number of trained staff. 100% of your staff had to have at least a minimum 90, and a certain number, the 2-year diploma and so on. We wanted them to have the parent advisory committee, and we didn't want them to just have that as a fundraising home and school kind of advisory committee. We wanted them to tell us exactly, what are you going to do with your parents, and how's this going to work, and what's it going to look like. We wanted them to give us staff policies. We wanted them to give us their parent policies. We wanted them to give us nutrition policies. So we'd have centers say, oh, well, I post my menu every week. I'd say, no, that's not a nutrition policy, that's a menu. I'm looking for a nutrition policy. We wanted them to have an action plan, and I come from the school sector, and in the school sector we call these school development or school improvement plans. In our early years side we call them action plans, and we wanted them to have plans that showed how they plan on improving the learning and the progress in their centers. We wanted to, and they have no choice in this, we want them to participate in the data and the research and the evaluation. They can't say, I'm not participating. If you're getting government money, you're participating. End of the story. So, infant homes, I already told you, we're not there yet. So that's the only picture, and that's my granddaughter. The licensed retirement, it's basically the same thing. Centers identified their preferred option, and they told us, and we gave them a limit. If you don't tell us in those 30 days you want to retire your license, don't come back in 6 months and say you want to retire your license. We're not talking to you then. And they exited, and that was it. And that helped the other centers to find staff because the staff had to move. We also were hoping for collaboration. So some of the centers that did close, what they did is they amalgamated. So they might have been 2 centers that were close by, and everybody just moved over to one center to make it larger and more viable in the first place. The private sector are those who remain behind. There's about, I think, around 10 of those. And they told us that they were going to stay as private centers. In the old world, there was a maintenance grant that every center received. And what we told the private centers is you will continue to receive that maintenance grant until January 2012 when the first round of evaluation and research is done. And by then, we will decide whether the maintenance grants will continue. My bias is they shouldn't continue. If you're not doing what we're asking you to do, why should we give you the money? So that's kind of where I'm at. The research and evaluation, we don't have an OIZ on PEI, and we wanted to build some capacity, both at Holland College and at UPEI in the field of early childhood development. So we have an administrative team that administers what we're looking for, and the work is being led by Audrey Penner, Dr. Penner at Holland College, and it's being shared between Holland College and UPEI. And it's not, you know, here we have George Brown working with U of T, which is fabulous, and other partnerships, but it's not always, if people have never worked together, you have to create that shared understanding for people to work together and say, okay, I'll do this piece, and you do that piece, and so on. So basically, this evaluation is going to provide the baseline. We need to know where the kids are to see if what we're doing is going to make a difference in the future. And what we're looking at are things like governance, quality, access, and sustainability. I am flying through this stuff. This is my next to last slide. So the lessons learned so far. Oh, and I want to recognize the fact that PEI did put some money to do the research and evaluation, which is an easy budget to cut, as Ellen and Steve mentioned this morning. And I want to recognize the fact that Jane jumped in with the Margaret and Wallace McCain Foundation to help with that research and evaluation, and I thank you for that. It's very much appreciated. So the lessons learned, the number one lesson is communication. I can't say enough about how important it is for people to work together and talk to each other, not ignore the phone. We had over 20 Saturday meetings when our teams went out and met with different centers, operators. We'd have evening meetings, and a lot of the decisions were made on the fly, as I said, as we were building the plane. And I remember distinctly one night we had a meeting in the middle of the province, and everybody was kind of on pins and needles, and we'd get questions about, well, what are we going to do about this? Are you going to pay for that? Who's going to do this? And da-da-da-da-da. And we'd have most of the answers, but if we didn't, the three of us would huddle in the back room. We'd say, we'll get back to you in a second. We'd go in the back room. We'd say, what do you think? Okay, this is what we're deciding, and somebody better write this decision down because we won't remember tomorrow morning. And then we kept going, and that's the honest to God's truth. So we had a lot of communication with people. The fact that the minister and the deputy were out front would be equivalent in a school board as the superintendent being out front. The person who's going to have, you know, where the buck stops. It's really important to have those people out there. One of the things on the pros and cons of the fast pace of the change was that we had talked to people in Ontario, actually, who told us it was kind of a 3 or 4 year implementation, and it was causing a lot of confusion. So we said, okay, we'll pull the Band-Aid off right quick, and we'll just do it. So that's how you make some decisions in the back corner sometimes. So the con of that, I mean, the pro of that is everybody knows exactly what the rules are, and they all know at the same time, they all hear the same message, so that's the pro. On the con side is sometimes you don't necessarily make the right decisions. And on the con side, I'm going to jump to the administrative staff burnout. Life happens to people. And we did not get an extra staff person for either the kindergarten implementation or the PEI implementation. And our manager of kindergarten and early childhood and early learning in our department was doing her master's at the same time and lost both her parents in that 6-month period. I got to tell you, Helen was talking about spousal abuse yesterday. It was nearly divorce for about 3 families in the department. It was a really tough time, so don't ever do this without some extra resources. It's very time consuming, and I'll use me as an example. You have wonderful Jim Greaves, who I love to death here in Ontario, but he only has early childhood. I had everything: English programs, French programs, special ed. So this was supposed to be 15% of my job, and this is all I lived and breathed for about 6 months, and the rest of the stuff just didn't get done. Too bad. Everybody understood. Thank God for that. Massive legislative changes. Our Child Care Facilities Act was ancient. We've changed the act, and we're now doing the regs. And I get calls nearly daily about, well, what do you think we should do? Should we have 3 sinks or an industrial-sized dishwasher? So the regs are a lot of work. And on Prince Edward Island, we have 2 legislative writers for every act we have, for the whole province. So they said, just you tell us exactly what you want, because we're not going to spend any more time on this than we have to. So it's a lot of work. The capacity building is a real lesson learned. You're building capacity, and in your cases in school boards where people are like me, they have K-12 training or 1-12 training. They don't know the early childhood world. I've been operating from my gut for a year. Well, and the fact that I have 4 grandchildren under 6, that's where I'm going from. So you're building capacity either in the ministries or in the school boards or in the municipalities or in the regions that you have, and you have to give people the opportunity to understand the evidence, the data, and to be able to absorb that and understand how they're going to sell that to the policymakers in their sector. For us, too, it was hard to get the true numbers of children because, for example, in Charlottetown, a family who would be looking for an infant space might have had their name on a wait list in 20 centres. So that child might have been counted 20 times. So one of the things that we worked with the Early Childhood Development Association is to create a central registry for wait lists. That was just launched about a month ago. So now we're hoping we'll have a truer picture of what the needs are out there. We still have our infant homes, and one of the good things, although we don't have our infant homes, by requiring all the early years centres to have infant spaces, it increased our spaces for infants by over, I think it's 85% or something like that. So we did increase the number of spaces for infants by having this initiative, which was a good thing. I went over my time, I'm sorry. So, questions?